Welcome to Vineyard Boise. It's our vision to make the invisible God visible wherever He places us. We come together on Sundays to worship and fellowship corporately. But we know that church isn't just about Sunday. It's about a lifelong, day-to-day following of Christ with other believers. We invite you to join us, just as you are. If you'd like to support our ministry, visit vineyardboise.org and click the Give Online button.
I want you to, as we get into the text this morning, I want you to maybe close your eyes for just a moment. You can trust me. I'm not going to do anything. I'm a pastor. Close your eyes and imagine that it's not March, that it's not raining outside. I want you to imagine that it's actually late August. And it's a summer evening. It's been a pretty warm day, but the sun has gone down. It's cooling off, and you are at the Western Idaho Fair with your closest friends, and you're having fun. Now, not everyone thinks fun with fair, but let's just imagine for a moment, okay? So now open your eyes. I want you to imagine that as you're wandering around the fair and you're going down that corridor where there's all the food, and like every step you take, there's a new smell, and you suddenly get a hankering for a caramel apple. A hankering for a caramel apple. And so you look around and you see the booth that likely sells them, and you go over and you say, hey, do you have any caramel apples left? I know it's late. I know you've been selling all day, but do you have any left? And the guy at the counter says, as a matter of fact, we have 2 left. Here they are. And he pulls them out, and he says, here's the caramel apples. Which one would you like? Now, all things being equal, and assuming you like sprinkles, which one are you going to be drawn to? Right? Probably the bigger one. This is amazing right here. If this was winter camp or even family camp like Chris announced, I would probably invite 2 of you to come on up. It's like, I have 2 people. I'll flip a coin and let you flip for who gets the fancy apple, the big one with all the sprinkles on it. And one of you would get that, and then you would bite into it and discover that this one is actually a caramel onion. Now, I'm not going to do that because I actually want you to like me. And I figure like tricking someone is not a great way to start the morning, but this one's actually a caramel onion. And the point of this illustration, we're going to just talk through this a little bit today, is that we're resuming our study. We're continuing a study we've been in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And 1st and 2nd Samuel it's a comparison and a contrast of the first 2 kings of Israel. Okay? It compares them because in the one sense, they have a lot of similarities. There's a lot of things they have in common. And yet, as we get into their stories and watch how their leadership plays out, their life plays out, we find that they end up going 2 different directions. And so what starts as a comparison actually becomes a contrast. And what we find is that there's Saul. He's the first king of Israel. And he's the one that the people thought they wanted. God gives them a king that looks really good on the outside. And they're so excited when they see him because he's rich, he's really tall, he's really, really handsome, and he's powerful. And they're like, yes, that is the king we want. And as the story plays out, we find out that what's on the inside has not really been formed, and in fact might be rotten. And so we get to watch how that plays out. We're going to watch how that plays out today. And then God gives him another king. He gives him King David, who is not quite as impressive on the outside. There's not the same like visceral, like, oh, like that's what we've been looking for. In fact, he's the youngest, he's small, he's undeveloped. But as we get into David's story, we find out that he's actually being formed at his core to be more like God, that he knows God, he loves God, and he's continually in a process of opening himself before God, welcoming God to continue the work in him, so that what comes out of his leadership is actually a blessing for others. That's the story. That's the contrast. I should say this. David is actually a foreshadow. When we look at the story of David, we're often tempted to find David as the hero of the story. We read the story of David and Goliath and think, how can I be more like David? But actually, David is always to point us to the greater son of David who was to come. We're going to see today in the passage, we're going to see 3 promises that God was going to raise up somebody else to lead his people. And in the immediate text, that's fulfilled in David. but ultimately that was fulfilled in the Son of David, in Jesus, who was the true king of God's people, who would be a king after God's own heart. So that's our comparison. We have an onion, we have an apple. And today our passage is titled Examined by the Fire. So, we called 2019, in light of just a kind of a modern day parable that we believe God gave us to explore, we've called it the year of the campfire. I can't unpack that right now, but as we're going through this text of 1st and 2nd Samuel, we're not looking at it every single line, we're actually looking at key stories. And so we've called this Campfire Stories. And this morning in this study, we're going to address three questions. The three questions are this. First of all, how do we know what is on our inside? How do we know what's on our inside? Secondly, if our inside is rotten, can it be transformed? Can the onion become an apple, is the question. And then thirdly, why should we even care? Why should we care? So if you've been reading or listening to our daily devotions, we have a daily devotion that Pastor Mike writes for us. He not only writes them for us, but he records them now. We have them available as an audio podcast. And increasingly, we're finding that that's a way that people like to get those devotions. The idea with those is that we're engaging in the text that we're going to be in before we come in on a Sunday, so that we're spending one-on-one time with God, allowing him to be the first one to really speak to us through that passage. And so our model's really not built on what happens in here on a Sunday morning. This is supposed to supplement what's happening in our daily life. So you can always pick up those devotions. There's hard copies at the back of the room as you leave every Sunday. But you can also, if you podcast at all, any kind of mechanism that you have for podcasting, you can search for that and find it. You can find it through our website. But if you've been reading or listening this week, what you discovered is that we're covering a lot of ground this week. This week's text, we're covering 4 long chapters, not even short chapters. I mean, these are like long historical narrative chapters. So we're in chapters, 13, 15, 28, and 31. And these are long stories that tell the story of, they actually narrate the downward spiral of King Saul. And you might have thought, well, why are we covering so much ground? I wondered why we were covering so much ground. I was on a flight with Pastor Mike the week before this last week. We were flying back from Chicago after a series of meetings, and I was beginning to study this text, and I was looking at the references. I'm like, 4 chapters. So I lean over the seat and I tap Mike, and I was like, why are we doing 4 chapters? And he just smiled and he said, because I wanted to be merciful. And I thought, well, it's not merciful to me because I still have to study all 4 of them. But the mercy side is this, that we don't really want to spend 4 weeks in the downward spiral of Saul, because it's pretty dark. It's a heavy story. It's a cautionary tale, you might say, of warning. And here's the warning. And I want you to listen to this carefully. The warning is that you can be immersed in the people of God. You can be serving God. You can be doing good things. You can even be leading ministry and still not know God. You can be unformed at the core, even rotten at the core. It's possible to be embedded within and identified with the people of God, to be faithfully participating in a faith community, to be at church every Sunday, to be tithing and involved in ministries and serving, without actually knowing God yourself, without experiencing the sort of inner transformation where you're becoming more like him. Today, we're going to peel away Saul's carnal exterior. Again, he's rich, tall, handsome, powerful. He looks good on the outside. But we're going to examine what's on the inside, and not only what's there, but how that played out in his life and how it rippled out to the people around him. So we're going to summarize some key movements. We're not going to read the text, all 4 chapters, and that would take the rest of our time, actually. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to summarize some key movements, and every now and then we'll put a text up that is just very relevant to that. So first of all, we're going to start in chapter 13. In chapter 13, we find the story of Saul's first military campaign after being confirmed king. So what's happened is the Philistines are one of the enemies of Israel, and they've actually established a few garrisons within the territory that was considered Israel. They've got some little beachheads inside of Israel. So Israel's got, they have to respond to the Philistines. And so Saul does this. He's become king. He chooses 3,000 of the most obvious candidates for forming a standing army. Remember, part of the deal with a king is that Israel at this point had no standing army. They just would kind of get a kind of a group together whenever there was a military skirmish. They would gather everybody and just have kind of an impromptu, militia. But there's never been a standing army. Saul, as part of his job as commander-in-chief, as king, is to develop that. So he surrounds himself with 3,000 of the most obvious candidate. 1 Samuel 14 puts it this way. There was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul. And when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he attached him to himself. He attached him to himself. He begins surrounding himself with any man that he thinks might strengthen his position, his cause, his throne. So that's not a bad strategy if you're commander-in-chief to look around and see who should be in the military. That's not a bad strategy. But there's also hints about where his security and his trust lie. Because remember, when he was first appointed to be king, Samuel, the prophet, was the one that spoke over his life, and he gave him some promises from God. He was commissioned by Samuel. Samuel gave him this promise. He said this is 1 Samuel 10:1. Samuel took a flask of oil and he poured it on Saul's head. He kissed him and said, "Has not the Lord anointed you to be prince over his people Israel? And you shall reign over the people of the Lord, and you will save them from the hand of their surrounding enemies. And this shall be the signs to you that the Lord has anointed you to be prince over his heritage." And what happens is, what follows if we continue reading in chapter 10 is multiple signs, 3 signs in 10 and another sign in chapter 11. There were multiple confirmations that God would be with Saul, that he could do what he was being commissioned to do, not because he was capable, not to do it on his own strength, not through his own ability, but because God would do it through him, that God would be with him and would do it through him. That's been the call on God's people throughout human history. Whether you go back to Moses, to Joshua, in all those cases, God said, I will be with you. I will do this thing through you. But now Saul's preparing for his first battle, and he's not thinking about how do I put my trust in God. He's evaluating everything from a human perspective, according to his own understanding, and he starts surrounding himself with all the strongest, most capable men. So the question is, how is he going to deploy them? Because there's actually, at this point, 2 fronts in Israel. How is he going to deploy them? So what he does is he sends 1,000 of those men with his son Jonathan to one front, and then he keeps 2,000 with him at the other front. How do you think Jonathan experiences that strategy? So wait a minute, I get 1,000 to go to that front, and you get 2,000 to go to that front. Regardless of how Jonathan experienced it, he steps out in courage, he leads those 1,000 men, and they defeat the Philistines that are at their front. And when Jonathan's 1,000 troops defeat the Philistines, Saul takes personal credit for it. The text in 13:3 says this, Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." And all Israel heard it said that Saul had defeated the garrison of the Philistines. We're starting to see what's on the inside of this lovely exterior we have in Saul. We start to see what's on the inside. We see fear. He's driven by fear, and instead of putting his trust in God and saying, okay, I know these Philistines are, they're more militarily prepared. They were better armed. We're going to see that in a minute. Instead of putting his trust in God, he's looking out at the human circumstances, and he's like, this isn't good. And so he's full of fear. He's full of he's self-protective. The fact that he sends 2,000 men, or he keeps 2,000 men and sends 1,000 with his son, he's self-promoting. When Jonathan gets this victory, Saul takes credit for it. He's like, how do you like me now? When Jonathan was the one that actually led them in the victory. Chapter 13 continues. Saul's been instructed to wait. There's a campaign that started. They've got some momentum against the Philistines, but he's been instructed to wait for 7 days until Samuel comes in order to offer sacrifices to the Lord. So Samuel is the prophet. He's the spiritual leader. Saul's the king. He's the military commander. Samuel is the spiritual leader. So he's supposed to come and he's supposed to offer sacrifice, which was a way for them to recognize as a people that we go out following God, that we're supposed to stop before we just jump in with our own reasoning, our own strategy. We're supposed to pause and say, God, how do you want to do this? How do you want us to move forward in this? And so he would do that. And then it was also this reminder that it was God that leads the way, even though they serve an invisible God, that he was ever present with them. And so that's why they're waiting for Samuel, but he doesn't show up on time, and Saul begins to panic. At this point, Saul and his son, Jonathan, we find out that they're the only ones that have actually like military weapons. They have a sword, they have a spear. The rest of the people, the other 3,000, you know what they're armed with? Shovels, picks, farming tools. And so Saul's looking around and he sees the people start to disperse. He's starting to lose the momentum that they have because of Jonathan's victory. He panics and he offers a sacrifice himself. Samuel doesn't show up when Saul expects. Saul begins to panic. He offers to sacrifice himself. And right when he finishes, Samuel shows up. It really, as I was reading it this week, it reminded me of that moment in the Garden of Eden. We read about this in Genesis 3, when God has given specific instructions to Adam and Eve. And when they disobey them, then God comes walking in the garden. And they're hiding from him, and he begins to put this thing in motion, the opportunity for repentance. And he says to them, what have you done? And so Samuel shows up, and the first thing he says is a question. Now, he knows what's happened because he can smell the sacrifice. But he starts with a question, an opportunity for repentance. He says, what have you done? He talks to Saul privately. And Saul, instead of saying, well, here's what happened, he immediately goes into blame. He says, well, the people were starting to disperse. You didn't come when you were supposed to, which left me with no other choice. Basically, what happened is the circumstances began to put the squeeze on Saul. And when the squeeze happened, what's on the inside begins to leach out. We begin to see what's in him. And he begins to blame others. He refuses to take responsibility. We see that his trust in God was not in God to establish him, but in what he could see, what he could quantify. He's leading according to his own understanding. You know, there's that very famous verse that says, in all your ways acknowledge him. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. Saul's not living out of that place. He's not choosing to put his trust in God. He's leaning on his own understanding. Verse 13, so Samuel said to Saul, you've done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God, for which he commanded you, for then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. And the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. And the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you've not kept what the Lord commanded you. That's a heavy word. It's a heavy word. He says God has now picked someone else who, at the core, has a heart after him, who may not be as impressive on the outside, but at his core has been formed and is being formed to be more like him. Saul has a choice here. What do you think he should do? What could he do? He's just been told, granted, he didn't audition for this job. He didn't put his name in the hat. He was chosen for this. This is actually his out. He could say, you know what? I never really wanted this anyway. So let's start this transition process. Who's this better person that God's raising up? Let's start the transfer of power so that it happens smoothly for the nation. Let's call the press. Let's get this thing going. But what does he do? He continues on as if nothing's happened. Remember, this conversation with Samuel happened privately. The people don't know that Saul has been rejected by God. So he returns to the people and resumes the campaign against the Philistines. Only now he doesn't have any assurance that God will help him. And in fact, he silently knows that God is now helping somebody else, someone who is a threat to his power. Which brings us to chapter 15. In chapter 15, we find Saul is being sent to bring God's judgment on the Amalekites. The instructions are very clear. Nothing is to be spared. No one is to be spared. Everything and everyone is to be devoted to destruction. This is a difficult concept, and it's not one we have time to really unpack here. But this is a mission of judgment that oftentimes we see in Scripture that God is doing multiple things on multiple levels. And so on the one hand, he is intervening for Israel's sake to establish them in their own place, and he's also sending them as judgment on the local people. And there's times in Scripture where we see that he's allowing people to just stew in our defiance, in our sin, in our rebellion. And sometimes that it's like the cup is filling up and it gets so bad that he says, okay, enough. That's the story of Noah. The story of Noah is that God's watching mankind. This is before the cross, so sin is just unrestrained throughout human culture. At one point, God says, okay, the inclination of man's heart is always evil, all the time, continually, enough. To stop the violence and the wickedness is better than just allowing it to continue, to allow them to continue harming and violating one another. Enough. And God has just reached that point with the Amalekites. And so he says, Saul, I'm sending you to be my judgment on the Amalekites. Nothing is to be spared. This is holy war. 1 Samuel 15:9, but it's never good when there's an instruction, a clear instruction, and then the next verse starts with a contrast. But Saul and the people spared Agag. Agag is the king of the Amalekites. They spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fattened calves and of the lambs, all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. But all that was despised and worthless, that they devoted to destruction. Basically, of the spoil of this battle, they keep all the good stuff for themselves and offer God all the lousy stuff. All the stuff that they would take to donate at Goodwill, that's the stuff they give to God. And then Saul goes on to erect a monument for himself so that everyone will remember his great victory for generations to come. The story says that oftentimes we see this throughout Israel's history, is that when there was a significant moment, they would build a monument, a pile of stones, that when future generations would see that pile, they would know, oh, that commemorates something that happened here. What happened here? And they would retell the story. And so because Saul has just won this great victory over the Amalekites, he says, this is a monument to me. When people see this, you tell them the story of how I did this. How do you like me now? Huh? And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, blessed be the Lord, be you to the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. And Samuel said, what then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of oxen that I hear? Saul said, well, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God. And the rest we have devoted to destruction. When he talks about the obedience part, he takes ownership in that. But when he talks about anything that was disobedient, he blames. Do you hear the blame game? Samuel said, though you are little in your own eyes, here's the kind of the defining reality of Saul's life. Though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and the Lord sent you on a mission and said, go, devote to destruction the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you pounce on the spoil and do what was evil in the sight of the Lord? This is the key truth that's driving Saul's life. He's insecure. He's dealing with inadequacy. He's trying to prove to himself and to everyone else that he's got it together, that he's good enough. I just want to suggest that so much of our destructive behavior in our relationships, in the way the choices we make, the way that we live out our lives, so much of the destructive things that we do are rooted in this very thing, that we're trying to convince ourselves and everyone else around us that we've got it together, that we're competent, that we're good enough. That's where Saul's living from. It's false posturing. He's trying to inflate something that's actually not there. The substance of it's not there. Saul vacillates between paralyzing insecurity. For example, when he was first chosen to be king, they're looking around like, where is that guy that was just chosen? And he's hiding in the baggage. He's hiding in the luggage. It's paralyzing insecurity. He doesn't want to step up. But on the other side, he vacillates over into an inflated ego, doing everything to prove himself in the eyes of the people. It's Saul who defeated the Philistines. Here's the monument. So to Samuel's question, Saul again insists that he has obeyed. If we were to keep reading, so no, he says, I obeyed. It was the people who disobeyed. He says, they kept the spoil, and it was to sacrifice to your God. It's interesting that he not only has no responsibility before God, he also has no relationship with God. What's on the inside? Samuel continues. Samuel says, because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you from being king. Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people. Here's why. Fear of God or fear of man. He leaned into fear of man. I feared the people and I obeyed their voice. Now, therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me that I may bow before the Lord. Saul finally and grudgingly admits that he did disobey. But it was because he cared more about what the people thought than he cared about what God thought, about obeying God. So here's the question. He says, okay, you got me. I did, but it was because the people pressured me. But now, forgive me and go back with me. Here's the question. Is that the beginning of repentance? Is that the beginning of a transformation? Is that the onion beginning to become an apple? Verse 30 gives us more insight into actually what's going on inside, because at this point, we don't actually know what's driving that statement when he says, come back and worship with me so that I can bow before the Lord. What's actually behind that? Verse 30 makes it clear. Saul said, I have sinned, yet honor me now before the elders of my people and before Israel. Return with me that I may bow before the Lord your God. This is not true repentance. He just doesn't want the people to know that God has rejected him as king. He wants Samuel to maintain the appearance that everything is good. Here's the universal truth, just freebie in this passage. When things are falling apart in our own lives, we can either put our energy into maintaining the appearance that it's all good or into actually dealing with what's really there. But we can't do both. We have to choose. You can either try and maintain the appearance. My marriage is good. My life is good. My habits are in control. We can maintain the appearance and smile at everybody, or we can actually deal with what's there. But we can't do both. And Saul chooses to maintain the appearance. He says, just don't tell anybody. Just come back with me. Let's go through the motions. You come and lead me in worshiping God and honor me in front of the people. Saul's not interested in, or Samuel isn't interested in maintaining that facade, so he says no. And he turns to walk away from Saul, and Saul, in desperation, reaches out and grabs his coat, his robe, and the robe tears in Saul's hand, which prompts the next statement from Samuel. Samuel turns around and he says to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day, and he's given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. And once again, we have Saul faced with another choice. He can let go of the posturing. He can begin transitioning the throne to this better neighbor. He can say, okay, let's figure out who it is, or let's go through the process. Let's find him. Let's hand over power. Let's make the transition. Or he can double down, and he can try and figure out who this neighbor is so that he can take him out, so that he can kill him. And he guessed what Saul chooses. He's consistent with what's on the inside. And the next several chapters, and this is chapter 15, and we're going to jump to chapter 28. The 13 chapters in between there are Saul in this really depressing decline where he's spiraling out. He becomes a madman. He becomes jealous. He can't recognize who are his friends and who are his enemies. Everybody's an enemy. God takes off his spirit, and Saul picks up a spear, and he's throwing it at anybody who he thinks might be that better neighbor, including his own son, including the people who are actually helping him to be commander-in-chief. Saul's downward spiral continues while he fixates on identifying and eliminating the neighbor. He turns from his duties as king, and he begins spending all of his energy and the resources of the nation for his personal vendetta, all about protecting his throne from every perceived threat. So now he begins to use the military to begin looking for this better neighbor who's going to rise from within and be the second king of Israel. And meanwhile, all their enemies begin to creep back in on every front because he's not using the military for that. He's using it to chase down the fugitive. The spiral brings us to chapter 28 on the eve of what would be Saul's final battle with the Philistines. At this point, Saul's an older man. He's terrified. He wants direction from God, but God is silent. He doesn't know. He hasn't cultivated the awareness of how to listen to God himself. He's relied on Samuel. Samuel's dead now. And so then he would turn to the priests, but Saul's not being able to hear God at this moment, not being able to seek him through the priests, is actually a prison of his own making, because in one of those chapters in between 13 and 28, we find that he slaughtered all of the priests in cold blood because he thought they had helped the better neighbor. This is a scary, scary man. A scary man who's insecure, small in his own eyes, and yet driven by ego, trying to puff himself up and trying to take everybody out who threatens him. So he's terrified and he wants direction from God, but God's not speaking, so where does he turn? Saul turns to necromancy. He finds a medium to see if she can get the spirit of Samuel to speak to him from the grave. And the situation just further exposes Saul's heart. And this is a weird chapter because not only does he try it, but it works. And I don't have honestly, a framework for that. And actually the medium doesn't seem to have a framework for it too, because when it works, she's shocked and she's startled, and she says, and she realizes that because he comes in disguise. He doesn't come as Saul, he comes in disguise because it's actually illegal. It's immoral and it's illegal in Israel to consult mediums. And so she recognizes who it is, and Samuel comes and he says, "Why have you called me from the grave?" And he says, "Well, I need to know what to do." But the spirit of Samuel doesn't tell him what he should do. Instead, he tells him what will happen because of his unrepentant disobedience. Here's the final statement between Samuel and Saul. "The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David." That's the first time that it's actually been named to Saul who the better neighbor is. He suspected it for decades. Now he knows. "Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines. Tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. You and your 3 sons will be with me in the grave. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hand of the Philistines." Saul has continued in his independence and his insecurity, and everyone is now going to pay the cost. Which brings us to chapter 31. And in chapter 31 is a brief chapter, but it basically, we see in it Saul and his 3 sons, they fall slain on Mount Gilboa. The soldiers that are left alive, they flee when they see their king, their commander-in-chief dead. Israel, the rest of the nation, sees their army fleeing, and they abandon their cities and leave their cities to the Philistines, who then come and inhabit them. And all of the ground that was gained during Saul's reign, Saul actually did free the people from their enemies, but all the ground that had been gained during his reign was lost in one fell swoop. And Israel's back where it started. At the end of this period of the judges, when they were asking for a king, they're right back where they started. And the Philistines gather the bodies of Saul and his sons. They behead Saul, and then they take Saul and his sons' bodies and they hang them on one of the walls of their cities to just make it their own trophy, their own monument to what they and their gods did to the people of Israel. So his life and his leadership have been wasted, and there's literally carnage all around him. Which brings us back to the 3 questions that we said we'd look at. How do we know what's on our inside? If our inside's rotten, can it be transformed? And why should we care? Let's start with the why should we care? Because without inner transformation, we just might waste our lives. Our potential in this world, the capacities, the giftings, the natural capacities, the spiritual capacities that we have in this world are value neutral. They can be used for good or for evil. They can be used for building up or for destruction. They can be used for others or for selfishness. And without inner transformation, without a process and a regular rhythm where we are making space for God to keep forming us and shaping us, we will be stuck with our unaided human nature. Without inner transformation, we'll create devastation all around us. We'll create devastation in our friendships, in our marriages, in our families, in our workplaces. We can create devastation within our church, within our communities. You know, there is so much destruction that happens. There's a phrase, it's actually a relatively new phrase. It's called de-churched, or the duns. They're people who have taken themselves out of a faith community because they've gotten hurt. Because someone in that faith community, somewhere along the line, and they had a part to play in it as well, but somewhere along the line, somebody was involved in the people of God, maybe even leading ministry, but didn't have the interior character like God. They were an onion on the inside. And when that leached out onto somebody else, they got burned. It happens in our families, our marriages, our church, our communities. We can spend our lives even busy around the activities of God without ever knowing God. Which brings us back to question 1. So how do we know what's on our inside? Well, remember I called this message Examined by the Fire. It's actually got a double meaning. In Saul's case, he was examined by the fire of circumstances. The circumstances of his life, the pressure when he was fearful, when insecurities rose up within him, those things became the fire that squeezed him and showed what was on the inside. If what happens to you when you react to a situation, even unthinkingly, and I think maybe unthinkingly is the true measure of what's inside of us, because it's the reactions that really say, well, that's what's really on the inside. I mean, given the right time, I can choose to respond in the right way, even if it's not coming from a transformed heart. But what comes out when we get squeezed? Saul was examined by the circumstances, and it revealed what was inside. When his buttons got pushed, when he felt afraid, insecure, embarrassed, vulnerable. What comes out when we get squeezed? In this sense, what's on our inside, what's at our core, gets examined and then exposed by the fire of circumstances, by conflict. And what if what is found in there is either unformed, maybe it's mixed, maybe you see like there's parts of me that are like Jesus and there's parts of me that are very unlike Jesus. I see both in me. That's me. I see both in me. What do you do with that? What if what's found there is unformed? What if it's rotten? What can we do? Which brings us to our final question, question number 2. If our inside is rotten, can it be transformed? And for our answer to this, we actually turn to the better neighbor, alluded to throughout Saul's story. We're going to spend several weeks in David, and we're going to get to see his life and see, although he and Saul started with such similarities, why did their lives go such different directions? And one of the beautiful things about David is we don't just have 1st and 2nd Samuel or 1st and 2nd Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings as the stories where we can find out about, they're like biographical stories about his life. We also have the Psalms. We also have the Psalms that are basically, many of the Psalms were written by David, and they are a documentation of his worship life. The songs that he wrote to God, the prayers that he prayed to God, it's like we have his prayer journal and we get to read it. And we get to find out, what did David practice that allowed him to become transformed so that what came out of him when he got squeezed was different? And when what came out was actually not good, how did he know what to do with that? The biggest difference between David and Saul is that David knew God, loved God, worshiped God, that he was open to God. We sang a lot of songs this morning about being open to God, welcoming him. David sang those same type of songs. He was being formed by God. David, too, was imperfect in his obedience, but he knew better than to hide anything from the God who knows and sees everything. Instead, he took a posture of welcoming God, of inviting God to not only examine him, but then to transform whatever God saw in him that wasn't right, that wasn't good, that wasn't life-giving. He said, would you transform that very thing? Because he knew something about God that Saul never knew. We're going to look at David's secret here. We're going to be in Psalm 139. I'm going to ask the band to come. And here's what I want to do. I want to take you through the beginning and the end of Psalm 139. And in the middle, there's some parts there that we're not going to visit today. We're going to have several more weeks to do that. But I want you to listen to what David says. This is in the NLT version, just for the sake of maybe reframing it if you've heard it, if you're overly familiar with it in another translation. Listen to how it begins. David says, "O Lord, you have examined my heart." David saying, God, you have done this in the past. You do know what's inside of me. You know everything about me. You know when I sit down, when I stand up. You know when my thoughts, even when I'm far away. Even when I'm distant from you, you're not distant to me. You know what I'm thinking. You see me when I travel. You see me when I am at rest at home. You know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say even before I say it. You know me better than I know myself. You go before me and you follow me. You place your hand of blessing on my head. I can never escape from your spirit. I can never get away from your presence. Do you hear the mixed bag here? There's a part of him that thinks this is wonderful, and there's a part of him that knows he's exposed. He's like, I can't get away from you. If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I go down to the grave, you are there. If I ride the wings of the morning, if I dwell at the farthest oceans, David is in Israel, so the morning is the east, the oceans to the west. He's saying, whether north and south, whether heaven or the grave, whether east or west, there's nowhere where I can get away from you. Even there, your hand will guide me, your strength will support me. I could ask the darkness to hide me and the light around me to become night, but even in darkness, I cannot hide from you. To you, the night shines as bright as day. Darkness and light are the same to you. David says there's nowhere he can go where God is not there. There's nothing hidden in him that God cannot see. God sees below the surface. He sees what's on the inside. He says there's nothing hidden from you. In fact, God knows him better than he knows himself. He knows what he thinks before he thinks it, what he will say before he says it. And even the darkness within David is not too dark for God. David has moments of disobedience, of hate, of selfishness, of adultery, of murder. David has moments that are very dark, but even that darkness is not too dark for God. Seemingly, this would be a scary thought. It's an intimidating thought to be that known, to be that exposed. I mean, even the people that we're the most transparent with, there's things that we don't share because there's things that we would be ashamed to even admit that we have thought or sometimes dwell on or have done. Even the person who's closest to us, I suspect there's things that we don't share everything. But David's sitting here and thinks, God, you know everything. But instead of that being a place of fear for him, as it was for Saul, he finds it to be freeing because he knows something about God that Saul doesn't know. And it's reflected in this verse. It's reflected right here. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It's too great for me to understand. Do you know why he can say that? Why he can think this is a wonderful thing to be this known, this exposed? Because God is altogether loving. He can be absolutely and completely known by God and also unconditionally loved. And that's what drives David to a place of worship. It's what drives him to a place of submitting to God and saying, okay, you have examined me, would you continue to do that? And that's where the psalm ends. We're going to flash forward to the very end. The psalm ends here. He says, search me, O God. Know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you and lead me. Transform me, form me. Bring me to everlasting life. In just a moment, our worship team is going to circle back to that song that we started with this morning. It's a modern day psalm like David's, that it's a song of welcoming God's fire. God, would you examine us? You are holy, we are not. Would you do it in us? If we're not a people who regularly have these type of rhythms where we keep coming back to God, we keep making space and saying, God, would you do this again in me? You have done it. Will you continue to do that? Will you continue to form me so that my life is a blessing to others? That the way I reflect you is with less and less distortions? That I'm living for your glory? That I'm living for the sake of other people? And in that I find my greatest joy? As we close, we're going to sing this song, but first I just want to give us the opportunity. There's an invitation in this psalm to find our own stories in what David wrote. So maybe close your eyes, and if you want to consider what posture of body speaks to being open to God, what posture matches what you hope happens in your heart and life right now. I would invite you to choose that posture. Maybe it's open hands. Maybe it's looking up. But here again, let David's prayer be our prayer. Let it be your prayer. Lord, you have examined my heart. You know everything about me. You know when I sit down or stand up. You know my thoughts, even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel, when I rest at home. You see who I am in the dark. You know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say even before I say it, Lord. You go before me and you follow me. You place your hand of blessing on my head. I can never escape from your spirit. I can never get away from your presence. Search me and know me. Search me and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you and lead me on the path of life everlasting.